Some of the men who are loved the deepest are the ones who spend most of their lives believing they're difficult to love. Not toxic, not cruel, just emotionally tired. The kind of man who learned very early that being dependable mattered more than being understood. The kind who became useful before he ever became vulnerable. And after years of carrying himself that way, he starts to believe something dangerous without even noticing it. That's all I really am to people. Useful, stable, needed, but never fully seen. And then one day, someone younger walks into his life and looks at him in a way that feels almost uncomfortable. Not because she's obsessed with him, because she notices him. The pauses in his voice, the exhaustion behind the humor, the way he says, "I'm fine," too quickly. The way he disappears emotionally right when something starts feeling real. And suddenly he feels exposed, not admired, not validated, seen. That's usually the moment he panics. Before we go deeper, if this already feels a little too personal, subscribe. Not for me, for the part of you that's been trying to understand itself quietly for years without having language for it. Because these conversations matter more than most men admit. Here's the truth nobody explains properly. A younger soul doesn't always choose an older man because he's powerful, successful, or mysterious. Sometimes she chooses him because his emotional atmosphere feels different from the men around her. Quieter, heavier, safer, but also sadder. And women are far more emotionally perceptive than men realize, especially emotionally intelligent women. They notice contradiction before words. They feel emotional absence before behavior confirms it. So when she meets a man who looks composed on the outside but carries loneliness underneath his calm, it affects her. Because wounded restraint has a strange gravity to it, especially when the wound never asks for attention. See, men often misunderstand what creates emotional attachment. They think attraction is built entirely through confidence, appearance, status, charisma. That's part of it, yes. But deep attachment? Deep attachment often begins the moment someone senses pain in you that you've learned to carry gracefully. That changes everything. And older men, or simply emotionally weathered men, often carry themselves with a kind of controlled sadness they don't even notice anymore. They've learned not to burden people, not to overshare, not to expect emotional rescue. Ironically, that restraint can become emotionally magnetic, because it creates mystery, yes, but more importantly, it creates emotional tension. She starts wondering things you never said out loud. Who taught him to hide his feelings this well? What happened to him? Why do I feel calm around him, but also emotional at the same time? And most men completely misread what's happening next. They assume the younger woman is fascinated by their experience. Sometimes she is. But often, she's responding to something much more human than that. Your emotional depth, your restraint, your quiet ache. The parts of yourself you thought made you less lovable are sometimes the exact parts that make someone feel emotionally connected to you in the first place. And that realization can be terrifying, because once someone sees beyond your surface, you lose the ability to hide behind it. A lot of men think the most dangerous thing in relationships is rejection. It's not. Rejection is clean. It hurts, but it's clear. The thing that really destabilizes a man emotionally is being loved accurately, especially if he spent years preparing himself for conditional love. That's why some men become strangely uncomfortable when a younger woman cares for them deeply. Not casually interested, not infatuated for attention. I mean genuinely attentive. She remembers tiny shifts in his mood. She notices when his energy drops before he says anything. She hears the heaviness hidden inside normal conversations. And he doesn't know what to do with that. Because emotionally neglected men often become highly self-sufficient adults. They learn how to survive discomfort alone. They become good at functioning while disconnected from themselves. Work, responsibilities, humor, routine. Those things become emotional armor. So when someone comes close enough to feel what's underneath the armor, his nervous system doesn't immediately interpret it as safety. It interprets it as exposure. That's why some men pull away right after emotional intimacy increases. Not because feelings disappeared, because feelings became real. And real feelings are dangerous to someone who spent years mastering emotional control. I want you to think about something honestly for a second. Have you ever noticed how easy it is for you to handle pressure, but how hard it is for you to sit still with affection? A stressful week? You can survive that. Financial pressure? You adapt. Loneliness? You normalize it. But someone touching your face gently while looking at you like you matter, that can shake a man who's been emotionally isolated for years, because affection exposes grief. Not immediately, quietly. It brings him face to face with all the versions of himself that learn to expect less emotionally. And younger women, especially emotionally aware ones, sometimes recognize that grief faster than older, more guarded people do. Not because they're naive, actually sometimes it's the opposite. They haven't fully numbed themselves yet. They still respond openly to emotional energy. That's why she may sit beside you and suddenly ask a question nobody else asks. Why do you always act like you're fine? And something inside you tightens, because she accidentally touched the exact place you protect the most. See, emotionally mature connection isn't built only through excitement. It's built through emotional recognition. Feeling recognized changes people. A man who's spent years feeling emotionally invisible will often become intensely attached to the first person who makes him feel emotionally understood without forcing him to perform masculinity every second. That's the part nobody talks about enough. Some men are exhausted from performing emotional stability all the time. Always composed, always logical, always dependable. But inside, they want somewhere they can finally unclench emotionally without losing respect. And when a younger soul offers that space naturally, not strategically, not manipulatively, just sincerely, it affects him far deeper than attraction alone. Because now he isn't just desired, he feels emotionally safe. And emotional safety can become addictive to someone who's been deprived of it for years. But here's where things become complicated. The moment a man realizes someone truly sees him, he often begins preparing for loss. Not consciously, psychologically. He starts waiting for disappointment, waiting for her feelings to change, waiting for reality to ruin the connection. Because people who experienced emotional inconsistency early in life often struggle to trust peaceful love when it finally arrives. Chaos feels familiar, calm feels suspicious. So instead of relaxing into connection, he studies it, questions it, tests it internally, overthinks small changes in tone and behavior. Not because he's weak, because hope became emotionally risky for him a long time ago. And this is the part most men never admit out loud. Sometimes the younger woman isn't healing something inside him, she's revealing it. There's a difference. Healing feels comforting, revealing feels destabilizing. Because once someone enters your life and unintentionally exposes emotional hunger you buried years ago, you can't unfeel it anymore. That's why some men become more emotional after meeting someone who genuinely cares for them, not less emotional. Before her, he was surviving through emotional numbness, efficiently too. He had routines, distractions, goals. He knew how to move through life without looking too closely at himself. Then suddenly someone starts caring about whether he ate today, whether he slept enough, why his eyes look distant when he says he had a good day. And now there's a problem. Because tenderness wakes people up. A younger soul often brings emotional presence into a man's life in a way that feels unfamiliar to him, less calculated, less emotionally guarded, more instinctive, not perfect, just emotionally awake. And emotionally awake people ask dangerous questions without realizing it. Questions like, why do you talk about yourself like you don't matter? Why do you apologize every time you need something? Who taught you to carry everything alone? A man can spend 20 years avoiding those questions. Then one person asks them softly, and suddenly he can't stop hearing them in his own head at night. That's why emotional intimacy changes behavior in ways men don't expect. He starts remembering things he buried, old disappointments, moments he felt replaceable, the relationship where he gave everything and slowly disappeared inside it. The childhood home where vulnerability was treated like weakness. People think attraction is only chemistry. It's not. Real attraction often involves emotional recognition mixed with unresolved memory. That's why certain people feel strangely familiar the moment they enter your life. They activate emotional patterns already living inside you. And sometimes a younger woman connects deeply with an older or emotionally weathered man because she senses emotional depth beneath his restraint, while he connects with her because her warmth reaches parts of him he stopped visiting emotionally. But this creates tension neither of them fully understands at first, because he wants closeness and fears dependence at the same time. That internal contradiction exhausts men more than they realize. You'll see it in small moments. He wants her near him, then suddenly needs distance. He misses her intensely, then becomes emotionally quiet when she's actually there. He craves reassurance, but struggles to ask for it directly. From the outside, this behavior can look confusing. Internally, though, it makes perfect psychological sense. Men who learn to suppress emotional needs often experience deep connection as both relief and threat simultaneously. Relief because someone finally sees them, threat because now they have something meaningful to lose. And loss hits differently when you already know what emotional emptiness feels like. That's why some men sabotage peaceful relationships without understanding why. Not because they enjoy pain, because pain feels more manageable than vulnerability. Vulnerability requires trust. Trust requires uncertainty. And uncertainty terrifies people who survived emotional inconsistency by becoming hyper-independent. But there's something else happening underneath all this that almost nobody talks about honestly. Sometimes the younger soul loves him deeply because she sees the softness he hides from the world. Not weakness, softness. The gentleness in the way he listens, the restraint in the way he handles anger, the sadness behind the maturity, the exhausted kindness. Women notice these things far more than men think they do, especially women who grew up emotionally observing people carefully. And when she realizes that his strength was built partly from survival, her feelings often deepen, not disappear. Because emotionally aware women are rarely searching for perfection. They're searching for emotional truth. There's a moment in almost every emotionally intense connection where everything looks the same on the outside, but internally, something has already shifted. It's subtle. No dramatic event, no argument, no confession, just a quiet realization in him. I didn't expect to matter like this to someone. And that thought alone can change the entire emotional architecture of a man. Because if you've spent years being needed but not truly emotionally held, then being felt is unfamiliar in a way that doesn't immediately register as comfort. It registers as responsibility. And responsibility can feel heavy when you're used to carrying yourself alone. So he starts doing something interesting without realizing it. He begins to monitor the connection. Not in a controlling way, in a protective way. He watches her mood shifts more closely than she knows. He reads between lines that weren't meant to be analyzed. He starts preparing for emotional withdrawal even while things are still good. Because part of him is still waiting for the pattern he knows best. People get close, then leave. That expectation doesn't disappear just because something good is happening. It sits underneath it. Quiet. Persistent. And here's where the younger soul dynamic becomes emotionally complex. She often brings emotional spontaneity into his life. She expresses things directly. She reacts in real time. She doesn't always carry the same emotional restraint he does. And for a man who has spent years regulating himself just to stay stable, that emotional openness can feel like oxygen. But also unpredictability. And unpredictability triggers old survival instincts. So he oscillates. Closeness, then distance. Warmth, then silence. Engagement, then withdrawal. Not because he is playing games, but because his nervous system is trying to balance two conflicting truths. This feels good, but I've lost things like this before. And that internal tension creates emotional confusion on both sides. She may start wondering what she did wrong. He may start wondering if he's becoming too attached. Neither fully seeing that what's actually happening is older than both of them. It's emotional conditioning. And emotional conditioning doesn't dissolve just because something finally feels right. It takes time for safety to feel normal. especially for men who learned early that emotional dependence leads to disappointment. So when someone finally gives him consistent emotional warmth, part of him leans in, but another part starts preparing an exit strategy he doesn't consciously want to use. And this is where misunderstanding often begins, because from the outside, emotional withdrawal looks like disinterest, but internally, it can be the exact opposite. Sometimes he pulls away not because he cares less, but because he cares more than he knows how to handle. And that's a difficult truth to sit with, because it means the problem isn't lack of feeling, it's lack of emotional capacity to hold what he feels without fear. And then there's her side of it. The younger soul often doesn't approach love with the same emotional armor. She feels things more directly, less filtered, less defended. So when she senses distance, she doesn't always interpret it as self-protection. She interprets it as emotional loss. And that difference in interpretation creates the quiet tension that sits under many deeply emotional connections. One person is trying not to feel overwhelmed. The other is trying not to feel abandoned. And both are reacting to the same space in different ways. What makes this even more psychologically intense is that he doesn't just feel her presence, he feels how she feels about him. That emotional mirroring is powerful, because being seen emotionally by someone who genuinely cares doesn't just make a man feel loved, it makes him reflect on who he is when he is loved. And that reflection can be unsettling if he doesn't fully trust himself yet with emotional stability. So he starts asking questions internally he would never say out loud. Am I good for her? Am I going to disappoint her eventually? Does she see the real version of me, or the version I'm trying to be? And those questions don't create distance intentionally, but they create hesitation. And hesitation changes emotional rhythm. And emotional rhythm is what people interpret as love, or loss, or uncertainty, even when the truth is much quieter than all of that. There's something men rarely recognize about themselves until it's too late to pretend otherwise. They don't always fall in love with ease, but when they do, it tends to expose the places they've been emotionally sleeping for years. Not because the other person is special in a dramatic sense, but because she reaches areas of emotional life he stopped visiting a long time ago. And that can feel like both return and disruption, especially when the connection is with someone younger, whose emotional language hasn't been hardened by repetition, disappointment, or long-term emotional compromise. She still reacts, still feels things in real time, still believes on some level that emotional honesty should be met with emotional presence. And that difference alone can create a strange kind of imbalance inside him, because he's used to managing feelings privately, silently, efficiently, without needing them witnessed. So when she starts noticing him, really noticing him, it interrupts a pattern he didn't know was automatic. He starts becoming aware of how often he minimizes himself, how quickly he shifts attention away from his own needs, how easily he redirects conversations away from his emotional state. And the uncomfortable realization begins to form. I don't actually let people stay close to me for long, do I? That's not a romantic thought. It's an identity-level question. And identity-level questions don't stay theoretical. They sit in the background of everything, even in laughter, even in attraction, even in intimacy. Now here's where things get even more psychologically layered. A younger soul often doesn't approach emotional distance with calculation. She feels it as it happens. So when he withdraws slightly, she reacts to the emotional temperature shift before she can rationalize it. Not with blame, with sensitivity. And that sensitivity can feel overwhelming to a man who is used to emotional privacy. Because suddenly, nothing is fully hidden anymore. Not his fatigue, not his hesitation, not his internal conflict. And that creates a very specific kind of emotional pressure. The pressure of being emotionally known without being emotionally ready. So he may begin to simplify himself around her, act a little more composed, speak a little less about what he's actually feeling, delay responses, control emotional expression more tightly, not to deceive her, but to regain internal control. Because when someone sees you clearly enough, you can no longer drift through your own emotional habits unconsciously. You become visible to yourself through them, and that visibility can be uncomfortable. But here's the deeper truth that sits underneath all of this. What he experiences as intensity is often not intensity at all. It's emotional honesty meeting emotional history, the present moment colliding with unresolved emotional memory. And when that happens, the mind tries to interpret it as confusion. But the heart experiences it as recognition. That's why he can feel deeply connected to someone and still feel uncertain at the same time. Those two experiences are not contradictions. They are simultaneous realities inside someone who hasn't fully reconciled with their emotional past. And the younger soul, she doesn't necessarily create that tension. She reveals where it already exists, because she responds, she engages, she mirrors, she asks questions that don't allow emotional avoidance to stay invisible. And in doing that, she becomes a kind of emotional mirror he didn't realize he needed and wasn't fully prepared for. So he starts noticing something unsettling. When she is present, he feels more alive. When she is absent, he feels more like himself again, but less emotionally awake. And that contrast creates internal conflict, because one version of him feels safer, the other feels more real. And now he's stuck between comfort and authenticity, between emotional control and emotional truth. And neither choice feels simple anymore. At some point, a man stops asking what she feels and starts quietly asking something harder. What is this bringing out of me? Because that's usually where the real story has been hiding the entire time. Not in her behavior, not in the age difference, not even in the intensity of emotion, but in what he becomes aware of inside himself when someone stays close enough to matter. A younger soul doesn't just enter a man's life as a person, she enters as a contrast, against his silence, against his restraint, against the long years where emotional expression became something delayed, filtered, or postponed until it was no longer needed. And that contrast forces awareness. He starts noticing things he used to overlook in himself, how often he chooses control over honesty, how quickly he defaults to emotional independence even when he doesn't want to, how unfamiliar it feels to be consistently emotionally received without having to earn it through performance. And the uncomfortable realization begins to settle in. I didn't realize how disconnected I had become from being emotionally close to someone. That's not a romantic awakening. It's an emotional recalibration. And recalibration often feels unstable before it feels clear. So when people ask why a younger soul might love him deeply, the answer isn't about age in any simple sense. It's about emotional timing. She meets him at a point where his emotional life is no longer performative, but not yet fully open. He has depth, but also layers of protection around it. And she responds to what she can feel underneath those layers. Not perfectly, not always wisely, but honestly. And honesty is what changes the emotional atmosphere between two people more than anything else. But here's what matters most, and what often gets missed in overly romanticized interpretations of this dynamic. This kind of connection is not automatically meant to last forever in its intense form, because intensity is not the same thing as stability. Intensity is what happens when emotional recognition is still unfolding. Stability is what happens when both people have learned how to hold what they see without fear. And many men in this situation are still learning that second part, learning how to stay emotionally present without retreating, learning how to receive care without questioning its eventual loss, learning how to be seen without feeling exposed. And that takes time, not explanation, not reassurance, time. So the real reason a younger soul can feel deeply for an older or emotionally weathered man isn't mystical, it's psychological. She responds to emotional depth she can sense but not fully define. He responds to emotional presence he hasn't experienced consistently in a long time. And in between those two experiences, something meaningful can form. But also something fragile, because anything built on emotional awakening will always require emotional maturity to sustain. Otherwise, one person will keep evolving inwardly, while the other keeps trying to understand what is happening externally. And that gap becomes the real challenge. Not love itself, but what love reveals about readiness, about capacity, about emotional history still living quietly inside the present. And if there's one thing I want you to take from all of this, It's not a conclusion about her. It's a question about you. What part of you feels more seen in silence than in words? Because that's usually where the real work begins.